looking beneath the surface. And so we're continuing today in our series that we've been focusing on this year, which is emotionally healthy discipleship and emotionally healthy relationships, an emotionally healthy church. I want to refer you to previous sermons. If this is your first sermon listening to this, the first sermon in the series, we did case studies. Newport Richie, do you remember that one? Case studies, do you remember? Right, the husband had an affair years ago. Wife just found out about it, right? And the pastor says, great, I'm glad that you're convicted. Wife, here's a book on learning how to forgive your husband, and we're going to pray and hope for the best. You remember those case studies? All right, there were several of them, okay? So I don't want to review that. If you're interested in hearing those, I preached that in a previous sermon. We also looked at the biblical basis for emotional health. Again, a previous service, we defined what emotional health looks like, and I also handed out an assessment. Lauren, do you have that assessment? All right, good. Why don't you hand out that assessment again? We're going to hand this out again. Just you don't have to raise your hand if you want to. How many of you did that assessment that I handed out? Okay, all right, we have one person. All right, like I said, you don't have to if you don't want to. Two people, okay, thank you. Let's say, all right, good. So I'm going to hand it out again. The difference between this one and the one that I handed out is that this one has the key to be able to evaluate it, right? Because I think the one I handed out before, it didn't give any instruction about how to tally up the results. So I'm going to hand it out again. But again, this one has the key about how to tally it. So this is going to be an important assessment. Give one out to every person. It's important that you do this assessment. And so when we talk about emotional health, principle number one about emotional health is looking beneath the surface. And so that's where we're going to go here today, is looking beneath the surface. So while you guys are receiving that handout, just take it. You don't have to look at it right now, but that is going to be your homework as well. Fill that out when you get a chance. Principle number one in our journey towards emotional health, principle number one is looking beneath the surface. And look at these biblical principles here that we find. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 5, which was actually on the bulletin cover here today. Notice what the Bible says here in Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 5. The purposes of the heart are... Did you hear that? The purposes of the heart are deep waters. What is going on with people? Like, what is inside of our minds, inside of our beings, inside of our hearts? The Bible says that it is deep. There are deep waters. But those with understanding are able to do what? Draw them out, figure things out. Again, the idea is looking beneath the surface. Notice what this one says here, 2 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 5. This is the Apostle Paul. He says, examine yourselves to see whether you are living in the faith, and test yourselves, is what he says. So here it goes again. When we talk about looking beneath the surface, when we talk about our hearts and what's happening inside of us, are deep waters. Here the Apostle Paul is calling us to examine ourselves, to take a look beneath the surface. And this is the ability, Newport Richie. Paul is talking to us about the ability and the skill to be introspective. Now, there's a difference here, and I'm going to throw out two words here. There's a difference between being self-aware, which is what we're aiming for, being self-aware versus being self-conscious. When you're self-conscious, you're worried about what other people are thinking about you, and so I wonder if my church members, are they going to get on me because I'm not wearing a suit and tie today? But wait a minute, some people tell me they like it when I don't wear a suit and tie. Wait a minute, but other people tell me they hate it when I don't wear a suit and tie. Oh no, what am I going to do? Are they going to like me or not? Self-conscious. Right? We don't want to go there, right? Within reason, right? I mean, it is important. I mean, I do care about what you guys think, and I receive feedback on you, right? It's not like, I don't care what my church members think. No, it's not about that either, right? There's a balance here. There's a healthy level, right? But we don't want to go in the direction of self-conscience. What we want to go is in the direction of self-awareness. That is, I am aware of what I'm feeling. I'm aware of the influence that I'm having. I'm aware of the emotional dynamic that is taking place. And that's what the Apostle Paul is calling us here to, the ability or the skill to be introspective, that is, being self-aware. And the Apostle Paul says it takes time. Examine yourselves. Take the time to look beneath the surface. It takes time and it takes energy. In fact, that word there, exam, in the Greek, it implies to make an effort. To make an effort to do something, to try something, to attempt something. That is, examine yourselves to see. It is an endeavor to discover the nature or the character of something or someone. And in this case, it's about us. It's about our heart. It's about what's happening inside our mind. And indeed, this journey of introspection, of self-awareness can be exhausting. We may not want to do it. It may be scary to some of us. Some of us don't want to do it, don't want to engage in it because maybe we're afraid of what we're going to find if we take some time to look inside. Maybe some of us don't want to do it because maybe there's pain there, maybe there's hurt there, and we don't want to go back there. But the Apostle Paul in Proverbs, they tell us to take time to examine ourselves, to go beneath the surface. And then the Apostle Paul ends it with saying, test. Test yourself. Test again. To test means to make a critical examination. Not that you're criticizing yourself or criticizing others, but you're taking a serious look. That's what the word critical means. You're taking a serious look, a critical examination of something to determine its genuineness. And when we start talking about this journey and looking beneath the surface, what we're trying to do is we're trying to answer this question right here. Who am I? Who am I? Now, I notice on social media, there's a little profile, right? And then there's a little descriptor there for you to write in who you are so people can get to know you. Like, who are you? What have you written in that description? What have you written in that description box about you? Who am I? This is what we're trying to discover. Who am I? Now, with icebergs, only about 10% of the iceberg is visible to the surface. That 10% is the part of our lives of which we are consciously aware of and maybe show to others. And sometimes I even doubt we show all 10% to everyone. Sometimes we maybe even just show maybe 5%, right? Or 3%, right? And so you see me here and I'm smiling and I'm kind of nice, but am I always smiling? Am I always nice? Or is there another side to Pastor Jonathan? But the reality is that 90% of the iceberg is submerged below the surface. The forces and the motivations, and sometimes, like I said, we're not even aware of that 90%. The forces and the motivations that will either make us or they will break us. That 90% that's under the surface, it will either sink our lives or it either will rescue us and it will keep us afloat. It's that 90%. And so when the gospel of Christ comes into our lives, Newport Richie, and this is probably one of the most important things I'm going to say here today. When the gospel of Christ comes into our lives, the demand that the gospel makes on our life is more than the 10% that people see. Newport Richie, do you hear me? So the 10% that people see are, oh, okay, he's not smoking anymore. Oh, he's not drinking anymore. Or he's not eating this anymore, or he's not wearing this anymore, or they're not wearing that anymore, or the music that we're listening to, right? That is the 10%. Or what Bible translation, you've heard this. This is the 10%. This is the superficiality of things. And the gospel of Christ comes into our lives, and it demands more than just that 10%, more than just that amount that people see. That 10% is too superficial. But what happens, Newport Richie, is that oftentimes we spend, as church and as church members, we spend a lot of time arguing about that 10%, arguing about the superficialities. Are you following me here? And it happened in the life of Jesus as well, in the gospel. And so here you have Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman in the Gospel of John. And Jesus starts going beneath the surface with the Samaritan woman. And he starts talking to the Samaritan woman about something that is painful to her. And he says, you have had 5 husbands, and the one that you're currently living with is not your husband. And Jesus is trying to go deep, because that's what the gospel does. It goes deep. It is not superficial. And as soon as Jesus starts going deep, it becomes painful. And so she switches the conversation, and she wants to talk about worship now, and how we should do our worship services, or where we should do our worship services. People did it in the Gospels. And so Jesus is here, and Jesus is talking about the heart and the issues that come out of the heart. And then soon as he starts talking about the issues that come out of the heart, and Jesus is going deep, Jesus is going beneath the surface, then you have a group that starts talking about how we should wash our hands and the cleansing and the rituals of it. Again, we're doing the superficial, that 10% that people see. Newport Richie, are you following me here? Jesus is healing people on the Sabbath. He is changing people's lives, and he's transforming people's lives. And then there's a group of people that start talking about whether we should pick grain on the Sabbath or not. And you see, we like to stay where it's superficial. But the gospel has a deeper claim on our lives. The gospel goes deeper to the whole being. And so that's why Jesus tells us in John chapter 8 and verse 32, Jesus says that you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Honesty and genuineness requires looking at the full truth. And that's actually what the Apostle Paul is hinting to when he says examine yourselves to see whether you're living in the faith, where the genuineness of your spiritual experience is. Has it only impacted 10%, or has it gone deeper beneath the surface? Honesty and genuineness requires looking at the full truth, the naked truth. The naked truth. And I use that word naked because it's a reference to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. We would rather hide from the truth. We would rather protect ourselves. We would rather cover ourselves up, or cover it up, or sweep it under the rug. We would rather protect ourselves and cover ourselves up from the reality of the 90% rather than come out exposed, naked to God. Because initially that truth, initially that journey for introspection and self-awareness, that initial journey is often painful. Because there's anger there below the surface. That 90% that you see my smile and I say Happy Sabbath on at church. But beneath that smile, there is anger maybe. There is pain maybe. There could be shame, there could be guilt, there could be bitterness, there could be hurt, there could be hate, there could be grief, there could be jealousy, there could be fear, there could be depression. And so it is initially painful, and we rather just cover it up ourselves. But the good news is, Newport Richie, that the gospel tells us that when we come out to Jesus, there's only love and there's only acceptance. Jesus says that if we come to him, he who comes to me, I will in no way cast out. That's what Jesus says. There's another verse in John chapter 3 and verse 17, and I remember this because I remember I was a little kid, and I don't quite remember how old I was, maybe 9 or 10 years old, but I remember when I was in church, and I remember some saint in church getting up and saying, I appreciate John 3:16. Can we repeat it, right? For God so loved the world that he gave us his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And I remember this dear saint standing up and saying, I appreciate John 3:16. But he says, you know what verse I like even more? I like verse 17. And as a little kid, my mind drew a blank. I didn't know what verse 17 said. And so immediately I remember looking it up, and it said, "For God sent his Son into the world not to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved." And that stuck with me since I was 10 years old. That when we come out to Jesus, the gospel tells us that there is only love and that there is only acceptance. Jesus doesn't reject us. Jesus accepts us. He doesn't condemn us. And so when we come out to God, what we will find is that we are loved. When we go beneath the surface, and when we stop hiding what we're hiding and covering up what we're covering up, when we come out to Jesus, what we will find is that we are loved. Newport Richie. And it's going to be important not only when people come out to Jesus, but when people come out to us as a church and as church members. It's important for us to also follow the example of Jesus and not cast out anyone and not judge anyone, but to love them and to receive them. And so Sheila Walsh, and I didn't know who she was until recently, but Sheila Walsh was a Christian singer, a writer. She was a former co-host of the 700 Club. Is that still a thing, the 700 Club? I don't know. Is that still a program? Does anybody know the 700 Club? TBN? Anybody? No? No TBN, just 3ABN. Okay, all right. All right, no, I remember the 700 Club. Pat Robertson, anybody? Okay, all right. Well, Sheila Walsh was a co-host on the 700 Club with Pat Robertson back in 1992. Sheila Walsh shares that she hit the wall, and she says, "One morning I was sitting on national television with my nice suit and my inflatable hairdo." I don't know what that means. Was that a thing from the 1990s, inflatable hairdo? I'm not sure. But she says, "One morning I was sitting there, a co-host of the 700 Club, sitting on national television with my nice suit and my inflatable hairdo. And that same night, I was locked in a ward of a psychiatric hospital." And Sheila says, "It was the kindest thing God could have done to me." She says, "The very first day in the hospital, the psychiatrist, he asked me, 'Sheila, who are you?'" Remember the question that we're trying to get to? Who am I? When we go beneath the surface. When we're talking about the journey towards emotional health and emotional healing. And so the psychiatrist asks her that first day, "Who are you?" And Sheila says, "I'm the co-host of the 700 Club." The psychiatrist said, "No, that's not what I meant." So he asked her again, "Sheila, who are you?" "Oh, well, I'm a writer and I'm a singer and No, Sheila, that's not what I meant. Do you see what she's doing here? She's equating who she is with what she does. "No, that's not what I meant, Sheila. Who are you?" The psychiatrist asked a third time. And Sheila said, "I don't have a clue." And the psychiatrist said, "That's right. And that's why you're here." Sheila says, "You see, I measured myself by what other people thought of me." Self-consciousness versus self-awareness. I measured myself by what other people thought of me, and that was slowly killing me. And she has a story that goes back to her childhood. But she says, before I entered the hospital, she said, some of the 700 Club staff who are Christian, before I entered the hospital, some of the 700 Club staff, they said to me, "Sheila, don't do this. You will never regain any kind of platform ever again. If people know that you were in a mental institution and that you were on medications, forget it. It's over. And I find this fascinating because here are Christian individuals, and for some reason, mental health and emotional health, it seems to be the only condition where we say, no, just don't tell anybody about it. Just hide it. Just cover it up. Just, wait a minute, just pray a little bit more. Maybe you should become a vegetarian and change your diet and drink a little bit more water. And maybe you just need to claim the promises of the Bible. I mean, what other condition do we do that if someone has an appendix that is infected and we tell them, oh, no, just pray about it and, do a little bit of essential oils right here behind the ear and you'll be fine. Or someone has a heart attack, and we tell them, oh, no, we're just going to pray about it. Or you're having a stroke or you have a broken and a fractured arm and we just tell them, oh, no, don't worry, I'll be praying for you, right? What about those who come from broken and a fractured home? What about those who have a broken and a fractured heart, a broken and a fractured mind? And so Sheila told them, you know what, it's over anyways. So I can't think about that. And Sheila says, I really thought that I had lost everything, my house, my salary, my job, everything. She says, but remember what she said, it was the kindest thing that God could have done to her. She says, but what actually happened is that there is where I found my life. I discovered at the lowest moment of my life everything that was true about me. It was there that I discovered who I was. And then she said, and you know what? God already knew who I was. He already knew all about me. He already knew about that 90% that was underneath the surface. God already knew that, and yet I've realized that God loves me still. And He accepted me still, just as I was. God often uses pain. Chelsea, what was that you said this morning? Pain, tears, and suffering. God often uses pain to get us to look beneath the surface. Whatever trial you're going through right now, whatever you've been suffering, whatever experience you've had in the past, oftentimes God uses pain to get us to look underneath the surface. There is a purpose in it all. We serve a God of love. We serve a God who works all things together for good, to they who are called according to His purpose. God often uses pain to get us to change. Notice what it says here. We change our behavior when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing. Unless there is sufficient discomfort, unless there is sufficient anguish, most of us will not do the hard work to take a deep, honest look inside. Unless there's sufficient pain or discomfort or anguish. I wonder how many of you are even going to do that assessment. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. And so we're going to end our sermon here, but there's Peter Scazzaro. He's the one who wrote the book, The Emotionally Healthy Church, Emotionally Healthy Relationships, and Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. That's his wife, Jerry, and I'm really thankful for Peter's vulnerability. He was a pastor, of a mega church there in New York City, in Queens, and I really appreciate Peter and his honesty, his vulnerability, and sharing his experience. We're going to end it here. We're not going to talk about it, but Peter writes, he says, I remember the day that my wife Jerry, listen to this, that my wife Jerry changed the power dynamic of our marriage, he says. Did you catch that? He says, I remember the day that Jerry changed the power dynamic in our marriage when she told me she was going to take the kids and she was going to leave me and go and stay with her mother. We'll end it there. We'll continue the rest of the story next time. Let's stand as we sing our closing song.